There are very few deadly competitive spectacles still around. You know, the kind that could be likened to ancient chariot racing, where not only are the competitors consistently putting their life on the line, but just attending the race is a risk.
Watch yourself, here he comes,
Racing in really any form is dangerous, even when engines aren't involved. Heck, a timed 40-yard dash can end in tragedy. But there's one motorsport race that stayed virtually the same despite there being consistent fatalities. A race that's just over 100 years old, but boasts some 250 plus deaths between bystanders, workers, and of course riders. I'm talking about the Isle of Man TT. This is the story of the most insane motorcycle race, probably the most insane race ever. If you guys want to dig deeper, check out David Wright's incredible book, 100 Years of the Isle of Man. It's fantastic. And I've also linked the official Isle of Man TT YouTube channel and website if you guys want to learn more. In the early days of the combustion engine, speed limits began popping up around the world for both city and rural roads. Generally, the speed limit was somewhere around 15 miles per hour. Now, it didn't take long for motorcycles to begin hitting serious speeds, and those who wanted to go fast, well, they needed an outlet. And so racing was born, and with it, the creation of racetracks. The idea to look to the Isle of Man actually started with four-wheel racing, not two, and not as an actual racetrack, but rather as a place to train and decide which drivers would represent Great Britain's automobile club in the prestigious Gordon Bennett Cup. A man named Julian Ord was first to go to the Isle of Man and map out a course that would test drivers to the very limit, even forcing them to traverse mountain slopes. In May of 1904, 11 cars set out across the public road track, but it wasn't long before two-wheeled enthusiasts caught on. In 1905, motorcycles showed up to decide who would represent Great Britain in the International Cup, and spectators showed up, and the track was shortened to 25 miles instead of 50, and to put it simply, British companies realized that they really weren't great at developing motorcycles with any sort of reliability in endurance racing. Most of them didn't start, most didn't finish, and Great Britain performed horribly in the Cup. And so just 2 years later, the Tourist Trophy, or TT, was born. This would be the first official race on the Isle of Man, created to push British motorcycle development. The name Tourist Trophy was meant to highlight this idea of making reliable touring machines. I know that seems silly now, but making a motorcycle that could run at its limit for 25, 50, 100 miles, it wasn't easy back then. And this race would prove the best way to develop reliable touring motorcycles. Instead of focusing on strict displacement rules or weight limits, the early days of the race centered more on the bike being somewhat of a true production motorcycle. It had to have a saddle, it had to have a toolbox with at least 5 pounds of tools. The motorcycle had to have a 2-gallon fuel tank. One interesting rule would change the course not only of the race, but actually the course of British motorcycle development itself for the next half century. It was proposed that riders would be given an allotment of fuel per mile. Originally, the idea was to do 1 gallon per 90 miles, but those who wanted to race multi-cylinder machines, that is, more fuel-intensive machines, well, they complained, so they decided to give those who raced multi-cylinder machines 1 gallon per 75 miles, and those who used singles, that, 1 gallon per 90 miles, and this essentially just created 2 races, one for singles and one for multi-cylinder machines, and so they had to decide which class to give the trophy to, and they decided the singles. And the only displacement rule was that you had to have 500 cc's or less per cylinder, and so the main 500cc TT class was born, with singles being preferred by many manufacturers, though multi-cylinder machines would be allowed to race alongside them soon. When I say that this would change British motorcycle development for the next half century, it's because creating big, fast, sporty singles initially from this race would be Great Britain's bread and butter, really until Triumph started to pioneer the vertical twin. But as you know, it wouldn't take long for the race to transform into something more than just a test of the machine's reliability. In many ways, it would be the riders, these early adventurers, who would be tested to their limits. Aboard suspensionless, virtually brakeless, antiquated, belt-driven machines that were powered 60 plus miles per hour across this varied and treacherous 10-lap, 15-mile course on the west side of the island, not only were these public roads, these were early 1900s public roads. Ruts, ditches, hedges, stone walls, steep embankments, rock and dirt-covered sharp corners. Actually, in attempting to deal with all the dust, organizers sprayed an acid solution on various parts of the track. Instead of fixing the dust problem, it just ate holes in the riders' jackets. They rode in intervals and the event was timed. Most riders broke down at least a few times. It wasn't just that you had to constantly pump oil into your engine manually, as these were total loss systems. There were tire changes and just general repairs, and of course you had to fuel up. But with an average speed of just over 38 miles per hour, a young man named Charlie Collier took the win aboard his family-owned Matchless. Rem Fowler would take the multi-cylinder class win, but he wouldn't get any official recognition or trophy until 50 years later. It was Charlie who received all the glory, with the first ever name engraved on the Tourist Trophy. I really think it's worth looking at these early races and bold pioneers. Without them, racing and motorcycle development as we know it wouldn't be what it is today. The Isle of Man and the racers who were passionate to win would push the British manufacturers into the spotlight and help them to develop the kinds of motorcycles that would later influence a little-known businessman named Soichiro Honda to push his own company forward. So today, if you're driving or riding a multi-cylinder Honda, you can thank old Charlie Collier. And so the TT was born. The event was a huge success, not just for British manufacturers as they worked tirelessly to win and advertise their successes, but also for the race itself. It would become a massive part of the economy of the Isle. Over the coming decades, the race itself would evolve alongside the manufacturers involved. The track got longer as the bikes got faster. The move to what we now know of as the mountain course happened pretty early on, and it reached its current 37.73 mile form all the way back in 1920. This version of the race is even more difficult and treacherous, and as the bikes got faster and faster, and winning became even more significant and more racers and manufacturers got involved, the terrain was as unforgiving as the speeds the bikes were capable of, with sharp turns, rapid elevation changes, and tight corners, all adding to just this insane level of risk. Riders were now expected to push not only their machines, but themselves to the edge of their limits with no margin for error. As more spectators flocked to the event, the crowd's excitement only heightened the tension, and soon the Isle of Man TT became not just a test of technology, but a test of human endurance and bravery. But these risks didn't scare away competitors. The race became really a proving ground for some of the most daring and skilled riders in the world, pushing the boundaries of what was possible on two wheels. But then something started to happen. The race became more competitive as primarily a timed event, but there was and still is no avoiding incredible overtakes. Superstars of the racing world were born. Manufacturers grew like crazy with success at the TT in various classes, including now sidecars. Thousands showed out to watch the spectacle every year. And to put it blunt, riders started dying. Now, it wasn't as though there weren't significant and even a few fatal crashes in the early years of the TT. World War I would force a 6-year break from the TT, and shortly after that time, the motorcycles shifted from being tourers to full out-and-out race bikes. Those safety measures were constantly updated because of crashes and because of some fatalities, from mandated primitive helmets to changes in the course's structure, as well as even motorized ambulances. There was no stopping the potential for disaster, though, with motorcycles now capable of powering through the entire lap at an average speed of 60 miles per hour, reaching top speeds of 90 and even 100 in the straights. Safety improvements would prove to be a kind of trial and error. For example, in 1927, the event took place over 3 weeks with practice included, but it's not just as simple as closing public roads for that long. Even with practice being confined to the early morning hours, you've got rural farmers who had jobs to do, and one rider fatality occurred just in trying to avoid a pedestrian. Heck, some of the fastest laps in practice for 1927 took place when the roads were technically open, with riders swerving around cars like Max Wrist. Occurrences like this would lead to more official road closures. Sadly, sometimes riders and onlookers would have to die for changes to be made. It's just such an insane track and event, it's difficult to really foresee the kinds of freak accidents that can happen. Now, the dangers associated with riding in this event would call many to question whether the race could even keep going. All the way back in 1929, opinion pieces would voice concerns not just about the safety of those involved in the race, but the simple fact that the TT was fostering faster and faster production motorcycles. motorcycles that were entirely too fast, making more power than any normal person could utilize on public roads. No, this isn't an old debate, and it's funny to think that these bikes, many of them wouldn't even suffice as beginner bikes for many today. Though there's no official, definitive document showing all of the fatalities of the Isle of Man, a good estimate of total deaths prior to World War II is just somewhere around 20 to 30. Yes, you're hearing that right. Despite a complete lack of adequate safety equipment and totally antiquated machines in modern terms, even up until the onset of World War II, the vast majority of TT deaths were still to come, and the reason is simple: speed and power. These riders saying motorcycles were too fast back in the 20s, they had no idea what was coming. After World War II, the TT resumed in 1947, with British manufacturers still dominating the field. Norton, Velocette, AJS, and Triumph played major roles in all of the races of the late 40s. The single-cylinder Norton Manx became one of the most iconic motorcycles of this era, largely due to riders like Jeff Duke, who revolutionized riding technique by adopting the knee-down cornering style. Duke's victories in the senior TT, 1949, 1950, 1951, and 1955, solidified Norton's dominance in these early years. However, by the mid-1950s, Italian manufacturers began to challenge British supremacy. Moto Guzzi, Galera, and MV Agusta introduced multi-cylinder machines, which were more powerful and smoother than the traditional British singles. MV Agusta, led by John Surtees, claimed multiple TT victories in the late 50s, setting the stage for a shift in global motorcycle dominance. Competition brought about significant performance increases. The Japanese brands and the onset of the high-revving multi-cylinder sport bike and superbike would change the TT forever. There was no keeping up with the advancements in motorcycle design and performance at this point. The Isle of Man race was and always will be a race on public roads. There's no way to change that. And these increases in performance would mean even more danger for everyone involved. The 1962 race was overshadowed by the death of beloved Honda rider Tom Phillips as he attempted to overtake the MVs. His teammate Jim Redman almost quit racing because of this. Racing was really dangerous at this time. Safety equipment, motorcycle safety features like brakes, and even traditional racetrack form, nothing could keep up with the speed of these bikes and the bravery of the riders. But no other race had the ability to kill riders like the TT. No other race could provide quite a spectacle either. Think the likes of Halewood and Agostini's battle at the 67 TT. In terms of danger, though, things would come to a head in 1970, one of the deadliest years for the race, with 6 fatalities, including Santiago Herrero and Brian Steenson. The deadliest event so far, even with significant changes to make the race safer, bringing in things like rescue helicopters. Some 35 years later, 11 riders and spectators would die over the course of the entire event in 2005, and that would be the single most fatalities in the Isle of Man's history. Even as recent as 2022, there were 6 deaths over the course of the Isle of Man event. Still, I have one simple question when I look at the deadly history of this race. How in the world is this race still going? And I'm not saying that as a Karen, I'm not saying that the race should be banned, I'm just shocked that it hasn't. It didn't take near this many deaths between spectators and participants for the public road race, the Mille Miglia, to be banned all the way back in the 1950s, but here we are, still year in and year out, with riders and spectators dying despite incredible advancements in safeties. 100 miles per hour within feet of a stone hedge and onlookers or just a big stone building, that's always going to be insane. I think the answer to the fact that the TT still exists is simpler than we might expect. Its legacy, its tradition, but more than anything, its glory. The TT's history is deeply intertwined with the culture and history of motorcycling itself. Its long legacy, marked by iconic moments and legendary riders, has embedded it in the motorsport consciousness. For those of you who've watched these races year in and year out, some of what's embedded in your mind, though, is tragedy. Each race is not just a competition, but a continuation of a long-standing tradition, a celebration of almost a mythical past. The long list of iconic, famous riders from Mike Halewood to Joey Dunlop people who became icons in part because of their successes at the TT. These things have kept it in the public's eye. Riders and spectators alike are drawn to the idea of being part of something larger than themselves, of participating in a story that literally spans over 100 years. For some, this link to history is enough to keep them coming back, even in the face of death. I mean, in simple terms, the race keeps going on because people keep wanting to see it and riders keep wanting to race there. One of the most compelling reasons the TT has survived is the community surrounding it. If you've talked to anyone who's been to the TT, I'm sure you've gotten an earful about how you have to go at some point. This event is so much more than just a race. It's a gathering of like-minded individuals, fans, and riders from around the world, all united by a love for speed, danger, and for motorcycles. The TT is as much a celebration of the culture of motorcycling and racing as it is about the competition itself. The island really becomes kind of a mecca for those who share a love for the sport. Everyone who's gone has told me that it really is a powerful and awesome experience. The bonds formed between riders, fans, and the island community are vital to the race's continued existence. The event's survival in the face of dangers speak to the shared dedication of those involved. For many riders, competing in the TT is kind of a rite of passage, and the camaraderie built around the race forms a kind of family, one that supports its members even through the darkest moments. There's also an element of heroism in the way riders approach the TT. The danger is always present, and yet these riders return year after year, not in spite of the risk, but almost because of it. Some of the most talented riders who have competed in the TT, like Joey Dunlop and more recently Michael Dunlop, have described their passion for the event as something almost spiritual. There's this sense of immortality that comes from conquering a course known for taking lives. It adds to the allure. In the aftermath of a fatal crash, the response from the riders is not one of fear, but almost one of respect. Many riders are inspired by the idea that they're participating in something that almost transcends the ordinary world of motorsport. It's almost its own thing. It's not about money or fame or trophies. It's about proving yourself against a backdrop of danger, a dangerous stage where the margin for error is infinitesimally small. For many, the spirit of competition and courage is a deeply ingrained part of the motorcycle culture, and this is just kind of the most extreme example of that. The allure is just so strong for these riders. Even after 10 years not participating in the race, Mike Halewood decided to return to the famed Isle, and his comeback win in '78 would go down as one of the greatest. Or more recently, think the likes of Joey Dunlop's incredible run, winning the event 26 times and participating in over 100 events, and then his nephew Michael Dunlop surpassing him with 29 wins. Or, Peter Hickman's all-time lap record in 2018, where he averaged a blistering 132.298 miles per hour. Unbelievable to think about the race laps over the years and the average speeds compared to that. It's insane to average that speed on this track. The Isle of Man TT has survived despite its fatalities because it's a powerful combination of tradition, challenge, and community. It remains to this day a testament to the indomitable spirit of motorcycle racing. For those who risk everything to race and those who watch, it's not just a race, it's a way of life. Racing a high-performance motorcycle at its very limit takes a certain level of bravery, or we could say insanity, but you can't even compare the dangers of even Grand Prix racing to the Isle of Man. It truly is the Isle of Man, not the Isle of Boy. And in many ways, that's why it's survived. It's like nothing else, a vestige of a time long gone, when riders dared to truly risk it all in a way that we mere mortals can't really comprehend, and maybe we're not meant to understand it. Maybe we should just be thankful it exists and enjoy it while we can. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.